Hey, 1302 students. So last week I talked a little bit about analyzing fiction with characterization. How does the author show you the character? So in what ways do you see this person? How do you see them interacting with other people? What is their personality like? What does the author say about that character? And then how are they described physically, emotionally, mentally, in all ways? So think about characterization, who this character is that the story is focused on. Is it told from the I person point of view, or is it told from the third person point of view, which is he, she, and that omniscient viewpoint or a limited viewpoint? So other things that you might think about is the author's style. So how does the author write? Is it somewhat conversational, formal, very traditional? How would you characterize the mind and the style of the writer? The plot is that can very quickly disintegrate into simply summarizing a story, but it's still important to think about how is the story put together. Where is the rising action? Where is the point of greatest conflict? And what is the conflict? Is that conflict internal, external, with a group of people, a particular person? If it's internal, what's the psychological state of that character? So that's something that you might consider as well. The theme is sometimes difficult to pin down, but that is important because not every story is going to teach you something, but sometimes there's a cultural theme or a moral theme running through a story. Sometimes it's just capturing real life and a particular literary story, and that might be fun in some ways, but it might not teach you that much. So one thing that I'd like to share with you right now is just a PowerPoint on basically literary criticism. So literary criticism began, if you think of the first book that was published and was set out, it was the Gutenberg Bible. So anything that was printed had to have a moral value to it. It was basically anything in writing had to be concerned with, is it making someone's life better? Does it help people improve their understanding of the world? Of course, in the information age, kind of anything goes, so that's somewhat outdated as a way of looking at literature, but you can still ask, what is the value of a piece of literature? Sometimes the value is its historical way of looking at things. So with the Kate Chopin story, you might think about two things: the feminist approach and the historical approach. What were women's lives like in the 1800s? Look that up. Does this help us understand what people were dealing with a little bit more? That short story gives you a glimpse into one person's mind and how they are handling what they're up against culturally. The formalist approach is maybe what you're more used to from school. This is basically critics are asking, how successful is this piece of literature? So if you think of all the different websites that critique movies like Rotten Tomatoes, then basically those critics are saying, how well is this movie made? How interesting is it? Well, this is similar in looking at fiction. How well crafted is the story? Is it entertaining? Does it have value on a socio economic level? Do you understand the lives of the characters more so? The feminist approach can be boiled down to this basically. So how are the women in a story presented? So you might even look at the Raymond Carver story. Although there is a woman who's openly talking about an abusive marriage, are the women at the table, do they have voices? Or mainly the men pushing the dialogue forward, since the writer is a man? Are the women described in prejudiced ways, or are they fully developed characters? So anytime you're looking at a piece of literature, you might say, in what way is the woman's mind, psychological perceptions of the world well developed, or is it stereotyped? If it's stereotyped, then there's something missing from the story. So what you might think about is like the difference between the Kate Chopin story, Story of an Hour, and the Raymond Carver story. And you might think, even though that story was written in the 1800s, at a time when women were facing a lot of difficulties in political arenas and life in general, we still get a lot of the mind of the character of the woman. Whereas in the Raymond Carver story, we don't get as much of what the women are thinking, what they're feeling. We do get a protracted story from one of the women at the table, but everything is still through the lens of the man who's writing the story. So that, and some men who write stories have well-developed female characters and some don't. And so, you know, that becomes a topic in graduate schools. Can someone from one race write about another race? Can someone from one gender write honestly and convincingly from another gender? Well, it depends. You know, in general, I think there's some authenticity from life that is lived at ground level. So people who have experienced certain things can write about them even in fiction with a little more conviction. The psychological approach, and all of these approaches are just ways for you to analyze fiction. You don't have to use every way of analyzing fiction, but if it really stands out to you one particular way, then you might incorporate some of that into your writing. So the psychological perspective is basically critics are asking questions like, in the work itself, what are the obvious and hidden motives of the characters? So, you know, we read a story later called Love in LA, you might ask, well, is this character a narcissist? Is he a little bit sociopathic in his dealings with the world? Or is he just lazy and materialistic? So these are things to ask. Then you might also ask things about the author as you're reading more poetry later in the course. And some poetry can be highly emotive and evocative in its language. You might ask, well, what was the author's life like? Beginning with Sylvia Plath, Robert Bly, and Sexton, a lot of people began writing confessional poetry about their mental illness, their pain, their struggles, and so poetry became more reflective of a person's life from that point forward. But before that, it may not be as reflective about a person's life. There were certainly examples of people who wrote more confessionally, but it wasn't as common, you might say. So still, if there's a depressing theme in a poem, you might go, well, what was the author's life like? Economic determinists ask questions about survival and the economic status of characters. So how do people behave when they are pressed, when they are pressed from all ends and need to make ends meet? So if someone steals to feed their kids, that isn't quite the same as someone who just steals because of their materialistic urges. So you might look at, how does the economy affect the characters? And does the work address this or no? Some works do, some works don't. And then ethnic studies and postcolonialism is another movement of literary theory. And this basically just asks, kind of similar to the feminist perspective, consider where the culture represented in the story is part of the dominant culture and how this culture is represented. So this analysis began after the Civil Rights Movement, had some of its beginnings in the Harlem Renaissance. Sometimes students think that this is an easy way of analyzing literature, the reader response, but it can be multi-layered and an important way to look at literature. So everyone comes from a different perspective, a variety of life experiences and beliefs. How do your experiences connect with the text? And this can be a deep way of talking about literature. So a lot of times I allow this reader response theory in your conclusion paragraph. So you might say, how did this particular story affect you? Did you have a similar experience in school? Did you have a similar type of knowing that the author has as well? So all of these things are important when looking at literature, but the main thing is to look back at the short story terms, such as the basics, first person, third person point of view, characterization, theme, symbolism, irony. These types of terms are things you should be talking about with short stories, but you might also add that other layer of talking about, if you're talking about characterization, talk about the mental health of the character in the story, or talk about how they're represented in society. But thank you very much, and I look forward to chatting with you more.